The Nevada heat didn't so much fall at night as it simply loosened its grip. It retreated from the cracked asphalt and the baked earth, leaving behind a lingering warmth that radiated upwards into the vast, star-dusted canopy of the sky. For Jack, this was the best part of the day. The tourists and truckers had thinned out on Route 95, leaving the small town of Goldfield to settle into its usual, comfortable silence, broken only by the distant rumble of a late-night semi or the chirping of desert crickets. Jack's garage sat at the edge of town, a solitary metal building surrounded by a fence cluttered with automotive skeletons and the ghosts of projects past. The smell of grease, hot metal, and dried dust was as familiar to him as his own breath. He was a mechanic, a man who understood the logical, predictable world of engines and transmissions. He found comfort in diagnostics, in the clear language of a misfiring spark plug or a worn-out gasket. It was a world that made sense. Tonight, however, a sound broke the familiar rhythm of the desert night. He was in his small, attached house, washing the grime from his hands, when he heard it. It wasn't loud. It was a soft, metallic scrape from the direction of the garage. Not the sound of the wind rattling a loose piece of tin, but something more deliberate. A drag, a pause, and then a faint, shuddering clink. Jack dried his hands on a rag, his brow furrowed. He wasn't a man given to paranoia. The desert taught you to be practical, but he was a man who knew every single sound his property made. This was a new one. Probably a coyote that had found a way through the fence looking for scraps. Still, something made the hairs on his arm stand up. He pulled a heavy, 4-cell mag light from a drawer by the door and stepped out into the warm night air. The moon was a bright sliver, casting long, skeletal shadows from the rusting cars in the yard. He walked quietly, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path leading to the garage's large roll-up door. He listened. The crickets had gone silent. That was the first sign that something was truly out of place. Instead of rolling up the main door, he went to the small side entrance, the key turning with a well-oiled click. He pushed the door open a few inches, pausing, listening to the absolute stillness within. He could smell the usual scents of his trade, but underneath them, something else, a sharp ozone-like odor, like the air after a lightning strike, mixed with something vaguely organic, something he couldn't place. He pushed the door fully open and swept the beam of the maglite across the concrete floor. At first he saw nothing, the familiar shapes of his tool chests, the engine hoist, and the half-restored chassis of a 1968 Mustang. Then the beam fell upon a dark, glistening trail, leading from the back wall where a metal panel had been pried loose to the deep shadows behind the Mustang. Jack's heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He followed the trail with his light, his footsteps now completely silent. The trail ended in a huddled shape, tucked into the space between the car's rear tire and a stack of old oil drums. He expected a wounded animal, a bobcat maybe, or a person, a migrant lost in the desert. He was prepared for blood and fear. He was not prepared for what the light revealed. It was humanoid in shape, but impossibly slender, its limbs long and thin like a spider's. It was curled into a fetal position, and its skin, or whatever it was, had a smooth, matte gray texture, like worn riverstone. There was a deep, ragged gash in its side from which the dark, iridescent fluid was slowly seeping. But it was the head that made Jack's breath catch in his throat. It was turned away from him, but he could see that it was large, oblong, and completely hairless. As the light hit it, the being flinched. It uncurled slowly, painfully, and turned its head. It had no discernible nose or mouth in the traditional sense, just a smooth, vaguely indented facial plate. But its eyes were huge, deep, and impossibly black, like pools of liquid night. They weren't eyes that reflected the flashlight beam. They seemed to absorb it. In those eyes, Jack saw no malice, no threat. He saw a depth of intelligence that startled him to his core, and beneath it, a profound and desperate exhaustion. He saw pain, and he saw fear. The being raised one of its long, three-fingered hands, not as a threat, but as a plea. A faint, telepathic whisper, more feeling than sound, brushed against the inside of Jack's mind. It was a single, repeating concept, a desperate, silent prayer. "Hide me, please." Jack stood frozen in the beam of his own flashlight, the silent, logical world of engines and transmissions shattering around him. In his garage, in the quiet heart of the Nevada desert, lay a secret that wasn't supposed to exist, and it was asked. For a long moment that stretched into an eternity, Jack's world was reduced to the space between him and the creature. The beam of his maglite was a bridge connecting two realities that should never have met. The silent plea, "Hide me," echoed not in his ears, but in the center of his mind, a feeling so clear and pure it bypassed all logic. His mechanic's brain, the part of him that saw problems and calculated solutions, was screaming. It listed the dangers, the impossibilities, the sheer insanity of the situation. This was not a stray dog or even a wounded man. This was a secret that governments would kill for, a truth that would shatter the world. Leaving it here, or worse, making a phone call, would be the sensible, self-preserving thing to do. But then he looked into those deep, black, fathomless eyes again. He saw the universe in them, a quiet intelligence that had traveled unimaginable distances. And he saw the simple, universal truth of a living being in pain, asking for help. The mechanic in him went quiet, and the human took over. Lowering the flashlight so its beam pointed at the floor, creating a soft, indirect glow, Jack took a slow step back. He held up his empty hands, a gesture he hoped was as universal as pain. "Okay," he whispered, the sound startlingly loud in the silent garage. "Okay. I won't hurt you." The creature's slender head tilted slightly, its large eyes never leaving his. There was no reply in his mind, only a faint, subtle lessening of the fear that had been radiating from it. Jack knew he had to treat the wound. It looked deep, and the slow, steady seepage of the strange dark fluid was alarming. He backed out of the garage, went into his small house, and raided the bathroom cabinet. He grabbed his entire first aid kit, a bottle of antiseptic, and a stack of the cleanest, softest cotton rags he owned. As he filled the bowl with warm water, his hands moved with a steady purpose that belied the tremor in his soul. Returning to the garage, he knelt carefully beside the being. The ozone smell was stronger up close. He pointed to the bowl, then to the wound, a simple pantomime of his intent. The creature gave a slow, deliberate blink. Jack took that as consent. He dipped a clean rag into the water and gently began to clean the edges of the gash. The creature's skin was cool to the touch, smooth and yielding like soft leather. As he dabbed at the wound, the dark fluid reacted strangely to the water, coagulating into tiny, jewel-like beads that he could wipe away. The flesh beneath was a complex, fibrous structure of deep violet muscle. As he worked, a small, jagged piece of metal, no bigger than his thumbnail, was dislodged from the wound and fell onto the concrete with a soft tink. Without thinking, Jack picked it up. It was unnaturally light, yet strong. Etched onto its surface were microscopic letters and numbers. USAF-EXP-734. His blood ran cold. This wasn't a piece of some alien technology. This was shrapnel, human-made shrapnel. A wave of profound relief and gratitude washed over his mind from the being, so potent it almost made him dizzy. The creature's posture relaxed, and the tension seemed to drain from its slender frame. Its large eyes slowly closed, not in sleep, but in a moment of respite from the agony it had been enduring. Jack finished cleaning the wound as best he could, dressing it with a sterile gauze pad and wrapping it gently with bandages. He knew it was a laughably inadequate solution for an extraterrestrial injury, but it was all he could do. He then helped the being move deeper into the shadows, into a small alcove hidden by shelves of old parts. He laid down a thick bed of old, soft blankets,
creating a hidden nest. He placed the bowl of water nearby, though he had no idea if it could drink. The being settled into the blankets, its dark eyes watching Jack's every move. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful curiosity. Jack backed away, his work done for now. He stood in the center of his garage, looking at the makeshift infirmary. The reality of his decision finally began to settle in. He was now a guardian, a conspirator. He was hiding, a fugitive from Area 51. The vast, silent desert outside no longer felt empty. It felt like it was watching him. Jack awoke with a start just before dawn, the gray light filtering through his bedroom window. For a disorienting moment, he lay perfectly still, convinced it had all been a bizarre, stress-induced dream. His mind scrambled to reassemble the logical world he knew, a world of oil changes, tire rotations, and the predictable rhythm of desert life. But then he saw the discarded first aid kit on his kitchen table, and the bowl crusted with dried iridescent fluid sitting by the sink. It was real. He moved quietly, pulling on his work boots over his bare feet. Every sound seemed amplified in the pre-dawn stillness. The creak of a floorboard, the click of the door latch, each was a potential betrayal. He slipped into the garage, his senses on high alert. The air inside was cool and still. Motes of dust danced in the single shaft of pale light, piercing a high, grimy window. He found the being exactly where he had left it, nestled in the blankets. It was awake. Its large black eyes followed him as he approached, but this time the gaze was calm, analytical. The terror had subsided, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. Jack knelt down to inspect his handiwork. He expected to see the bandage soaked through, but it was clean and dry. With movements that were slow and deliberate, he gently lifted a corner of the gauze pad. His breath hitched. The wound was still there, but it was transformed. The deep violet tissues were no longer raw. They were sealed beneath a thin, semi-translucent membrane that pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, like mother of pearl. The edges of the gash were visibly knitting together as he watched. It was healing at a rate that defied all known biology. A distinct feeling entered his mind, clearer this time. It wasn't just gratitude, it was an acknowledgement of his help, a confirmation that his simple care had been pivotal. This was followed by a flicker of disjointed, powerful images, a long, sterile, white hallway, the jarring shriek of an alarm, the dizzying perspective of soaring over the dark desert, followed by a searing pain and a violent, tumbling fall to the earth. The message was fragmented, but the meaning was clear. Escape, pursuit, injury. It was then that a new sound broke the morning silence, a low, rhythmic chopping, distant at first, but growing steadily louder. Whump, 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 whump. Jack's blood ran cold. It was a helicopter, and it wasn't a medical or news helicopter. The sound was too deep, too heavy. It was military. He scrambled to a side window, wiping a clean patch on the dusty glass with his sleeve. He saw it, a dark green, unmarked helicopter, flying low and slow about a mile out. It wasn't heading anywhere. It was searching, methodically sweeping the desert in a grid pattern. From the corner, the being retreated further into the shadows, shrinking into the blankets. A powerful wave of its dread washed over Jack, a cold, primal fear of being found, of being caged. Acting on pure instinct, Jack grabbed a heavy, oil-stained tarp and carefully draped it over the front of the shelving unit, plunging the alcove into near-total darkness and hiding his patient from any possible line of sight. He spent the next hour in a state of quiet panic, watching the helicopter move further and further away until its sound was swallowed by the immense desert sky. The immediate threat was gone, but the message was clear. They were looking, and they were close. He realized his guest must need some form of sustenance. He brought it a fresh bowl of water, and, after a moment's thought, a peeled apple, sliced into clean sections. The creature ignored the apple completely, but it lowered its head over the water. It didn't drink. It simply held its face a few inches above the surface. Jack, watching with breathless curiosity, could have sworn he saw the water shimmer and vibrate, tiny ripples emanating from the center of the bowl, as if from an unseen energy. After a minute, the being lifted its head, and the faint light pulsing within its sealed wound seemed just a little bit brighter. Jack retreated to his workbench, slumping onto a stool. He pulled the small, jagged piece of shrapnel out of his pocket. USAF-EXP-734. A designation for an experimental weapon, he guessed. He looked from the alien metal in his hand to the hidden sanctuary behind the tarp, to the vast, silent desert outside his window. The garage, once his fortress of solitude, now felt like a fragile glass cage in the middle of a hunting ground.
The next few days settled into a strange and silent rhythm. The world outside the garage remained unchanged. The sun beat down on the Nevada desert, tourists passed through Goldfield without a second glance, and the nights were deep and filled with stars. But inside, Jack's world had been completely remade. He had a secret, a patient, a guest. He had started to think of the being not as an it, but as a he. In the quiet of his own mind, he called him Nomad. Their communication evolved beyond simple feelings. As Nomad's strength returned, he began to share things with Jack. They were not words, but complex tapestries of sensation, image, and emotion. While Jack worked on the Mustang, sanding down a fender or polishing a piece of chrome, his mind would be filled with fleeting glimpses of another world. He saw the light of two suns, one gold, one white, setting over a landscape of crystalline forests that chimed softly in the wind. He felt the sensation of living in a collective consciousness, a society of minds that were interconnected, where loneliness was a concept as alien as war. He learned that Nomad was an explorer, a cartographer of cosmic streams, and his crash was a violent, unforeseen accident. Nomad's intelligence was subtle and profound. One evening, Jack was at his workbench, struggling with an old, intricate grandfather clock he was repairing for a neighbor. A tiny, irreplaceable gear had slipped from its housing, and his thick, calloused fingers were too clumsy to reseat it. Frustrated, he left the clock's complex guts spread across the bench and went inside for the night. The next morning, a soft, steady ticking greeted him as he entered the garage. The clock was fully assembled, its brass pendulum swinging in a perfect, hypnotic arc. On the workbench, the tiny gear was seated flawlessly, the mechanism humming with a precision it hadn't possessed in decades. Nomad was resting in his alcove, but Jack could feel a faint sense of quiet satisfaction, the pride of a craftsman who appreciates another's work. But for every moment of wonder inside the garage, there was a growing sense of dread from the world outside. Jack became a phantom in his own life. He stopped going to the local diner for his morning coffee, terrified of a stray question he couldn't answer. He drove 30 miles to the next town for groceries, paying with cash and avoiding eye contact. He found himself constantly scanning the skies, his muscles tensing at the sound of any aircraft. The illusion of their safe routine was shattered on the third day. Jack was cleaning a set of spark plugs when he saw the plume of dust rising from the desert road, the one that led directly to his garage. It was followed by the familiar, lumbering shape of Sheriff Brody's patrol car. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs. Brody was a friend, a man he'd known for 20 years, and that made him even more dangerous. He quickly wiped his greasy hands on a rag and walked to the open bay door, forcing a casual posture, leaning against the frame to block as much of the interior view as possible. Inside, he could feel Nomad go instantly still, retracting his presence, becoming just another shadow among the junk. "Morning, Jack," Brody said, tipping his hat as he leaned out of his car window. "Didn't see you at the diner. Figured I'd check you weren't buried under that rust bucket." Jack forced a laugh. Just trying to get this thing done, Bill. You know how it is. Tell me about it. Hey, listen, just wanted to give you a heads up. We've had some feds snooping around, Air Force guys, all stone-faced, asking questions about strange lights, sonic booms, that kind of thing. Said it was a classified weather balloon that went down. You know, the usual excuse. Jack felt a cold sweat on his neck. "Haven't seen a thing," he said, his voice miraculously steady. "It's been real quiet out here." "Figured as much. Well, keep your eyes peeled. They seem pretty wound up about this one. Anyway, don't let me keep you." With a final nod, the sheriff put the car in gear and rumbled back down the dirt road, leaving another cloud of dust in his wake. Jack didn't move until the car was a tiny speck on the horizon. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for the entire 5-minute conversation. He felt weak, his legs trembling. A gentle, sorrowful touch reached into his mind. It was a feeling of pure apology, the deep regret of a friend who has brought danger to another's doorstep. Jack looked back into the deep shadows of the garage. He couldn't see Nomad, but he knew he was being watched. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. They were in this together. But he now knew for certain the hunters were not just searching, they were closing in. Sheriff Brody's visit had been a quiet earthquake, shaking the foundations of their fragile sanctuary. Jack now knew that staying put was no longer an option. Hiding was a temporary strategy, a strategy that could fail at any moment with a knock on the door or a search warrant. The feds were here, in his county, breathing the same desert air. They had to leave. They had to disappear. That evening, Jack unrolled a series of old, creased topographical maps across his workbench, the paper smelling faintly of dust and time. He scanned the vast, empty quarters of Nevada, the forgotten corners of Arizona and Utah. His finger traced old mining roads, long abandoned rail lines, and the faint dotted lines that marked seasonal trails. He was looking for a place where no one would think to look, a pocket of the world so remote and insignificant it had been forgotten. He tried to explain the plan to Nomad. He pointed to a remote, jagged mountain range on the map, a place he'd only heard stories about. He said, "We need to go." He allowed his mental focus to reinforce the thought. Somewhere far away, somewhere safe. Nomad, who now moved with a silent, fluid grace, came closer to the workbench. He looked at the map, and Jack felt a sense of understanding. But then a new set of images bloomed in Jack's mind, overlaying the paper map. Nomad showed him the same mountain range, but his focus was drawn to one specific, unnamed peak, the highest and most desolate in the chain. The image was overlaid with a star chart of an unfamiliar sky, showing how the constellations would align perfectly over that single point. Then came a feeling, a deep, resonant hum like a musical note coming from the very rock of the mountain itself. Nomad wasn't just trying to hide. He was trying to get to a specific destination. It was a place of power, a place of connection. The plan now had a purpose, but it also had a problem. Jack's everyday car was reliable, but also recognizable. For this journey, they needed a ghost. His eyes fell on the hulking shape in the far corner of his yard, his old Ford F-150. It was a relic from the 70s, rusted and faded, and it hadn't run in 5 years. It was also perfect. No one would look twice at another piece of junk rattling through the desert. For 2 days, Jack worked tirelessly. He flushed the old fuel, cleaned the lines, and rebuilt the carburetor, but he hit a dead end. The distributor was cracked, a critical electronic component within it fried to a crisp. The part was obsolete. Finding a replacement was impossible. Defeated, he leaned against the fender, the useless component in his hand. He felt Nomad's presence beside him. He held out the broken part, projecting his frustration and the finality of the problem.
Nomad looked at the part, then at the complex heart of the engine. He didn't touch anything. Instead, he placed one of his long, slender hands gently on the dusty hood of the truck. A cascade of information flooded Jack's mind. It was not a language of words, but of pure concept. He saw the engine not as a collection of parts, but as a system of energy. He saw the flow of electricity, the precise timing of the combustion, the elegant dance of mechanics. He understood. He saw the flaw in the original design, and more importantly, he saw a way around it. A new, more efficient circuit diagram bloomed in his thoughts, one he could build using a handful of simple relays and capacitors he had in a junk drawer. Working with a strange, intuitive certainty, his hands moved with a newfound purpose. He soldered wires and mounted the relays, his mind and hands perfectly in sync with the schematic only he could see. When he was done, he climbed into the cab, turned the key, and the old engine turned over on the first try, settling into a low, powerful hum that was smoother and quieter than he had ever heard it. The final day was spent in quiet preparation. Jack packed the truck bed with cans of fuel and water, blankets, a toolbox, and a heavy canvas tarp. He created a small, hidden nest in the truck bed where Nomad could ride, concealed from view. The garage, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison they were about to break out of. As twilight painted the desert in hues of orange and purple, they both stood before the restored truck, a relic brought back to life by a friendship that spanned the stars. They would leave at moonrise.
The moon rose like a sliver of shattered glass, casting long, eerie shadows across the desert floor. It was the signal. Without a word, without a shared thought, Jack and Nomad moved. Nomad slipped silently into the hidden nest in the truck bed, and Jack covered him with the heavy canvas tarp, leaving a small, discreet gap for air. To any casual observer, the truck was simply loaded with old junk. Jack took one last look at his garage, his home. It was the only place he'd ever truly known. He wasn't just leaving a building, he was leaving his life, his identity, his quiet, predictable world. He locked the door knowing he might never return. The key felt impossibly heavy in his pocket. The old F-150 started with a quiet, confident rumble that defied its age. Jack kept the headlights off until he was a mile out of town, navigating by the stark silver light of the moon. He drove slowly, deliberately, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirrors, scanning for any sign of pursuit, but there was only darkness and silence behind him. They headed east, away from the main highways, plunging into the heart of the desert on roads that were little more than suggestions on the land. These were trails known only to old prospectors and lost tourists. For hours, the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. Inside Jack's mind, there was a quiet calm. Nomad seemed to have entered a state of deep rest, perhaps to conserve energy or perhaps out of simple trust. This silence allowed Jack to fully process the magnitude of what he was doing. He wasn't just helping a lost creature, he was the co-conspirator in the greatest jailbreak in history. He didn't feel fear, but a strange, exhilarating sense of freedom. He had always been anchored to the garage, to his routine. Now he was a nomad himself, just like his passenger, hurtling through the night with no destination but survival. It was around 3 in the morning when he saw them, a pair of faint lights that appeared on the horizon behind them, moving fast, much faster than he was. They weren't on the road. They were cutting a straight line across the open desert, off-road vehicles, likely military using night vision. They weren't just searching, they knew which direction to look. A cold knot of panic tightened in Jack's stomach. He could try to outrun them, but the old truck was no match for modern military hardware. He needed to hide, and he needed to do it now. A clear, calm image sliced into his consciousness. It wasn't his own memory. Nomad was showing him a narrow, almost invisible slit canyon in the low mountain range to his left, concealed by the shadow of a rock outcropping. It was a perfect place to vanish. The image was as clear as a map burned into his brain. Jack wrenched the wheel, turning sharply off the trail, the truck fishtailing in the loose dirt. He aimed for the hills, bouncing over rocks and sagebrush. The headlights of the pursuing vehicles grew brighter in his mirror. He found the canyon exactly where Nomad had shown him, a gap barely wider than the truck. He squeezed the vehicle inside, driving about 50 feet in until the path ended at a wall of solid rock. He killed the engine and the lights, and absolute darkness and silence enveloped them. A few moments later, two black, unmarked SUVs roared past the mouth of the canyon without slowing down, their searchlights cutting swaths through the night. They continued east, following the trail he had just abandoned. Jack and Nomad sat in perfect stillness, hidden in the stone heart of the desert, until the sound of their pursuers faded into the night. They were safe, for now. The hunt was much closer than he had realized. The silence that fell in the canyon was deeper than any Jack had ever known. The thrum of the pursuing engines was gone, replaced by the faint whisper of the wind over rock and the frantic pounding of his own heart. He stayed perfectly still for 10 minutes, listening, every nerve ending alive with adrenaline. Nothing. They were gone. He let out a long, shaky breath and sagged against the steering wheel. He had never felt so close to the edge. He got out of the truck, his legs unsteady, and walked to the back. He lifted the corner of the tarp. In the profound darkness, Nomad's large eyes were open, glowing with a soft, internal silver light. A feeling washed over my mind, calm and reassuring. "You did well, Jack. We are safe because of you." The gratitude was followed by a chilling image. It was the face of a man, sharp-featured and pale, with eyes that were not angry or cruel, but simply empty of all emotion. It was a face that looked at the world as a series of problems to be solved. And Jack understood with absolute certainty that he and Nomad were a problem this man intended to solve. Nomad projected the feeling associated with this man, not a soldier, but a scientist or an intelligence handler, a specialist, a hunter who was cold, patient, and utterly relentless. Jack dropped the tarp back into place, the image seared into his memory. He knew they couldn't risk moving again until daylight. The hunters had night vision, but they might not be expecting them to travel on these treacherous paths in the full light of day. For the next few hours, the narrow canyon was their sanctuary. Jack tried to rest in the driver's seat, but sleep wouldn't come. He watched as the moon arced across the narrow strip of sky visible between the towering rock walls. The desert, which he had always seen as a simple, honest place, now felt filled with hidden dangers. He was a trespasser in his own home. He thought about his quiet life, the familiar smell of his garage, the simple satisfaction of a well-repaired engine. It felt like a memory from another lifetime. Dawn arrived not as a sudden sunrise, but as a slow, gentle leaking of color into the world. The deep indigo of the sky softened to violet, then to a pale, dusty rose. The first rays of sun kissed the very tops of the canyon walls, turning the stone from gray to a fiery orange. It was a beautiful, violent spectacle, and it signaled that it was time to move. He spread the map across the hood of the truck, the paper crinkling in the cold morning air. Their planned route was now a trap. The hunters would be watching it, waiting for them. His finger traced a new path, a faint, jagged line that snaked deep into the mountains. It was an old mule track, barely a road, dangerous and slow, but it was also unpredictable. It was their only chance. He looked towards the back of the truck, projecting the image of the new route in his mind, questioning. He felt a calm sense of agreement from Nomad. The new path was harder, more perilous, but it was the correct way. The destination, the high peak, was still the goal. With the sun climbing higher, Jack started the engine. The sound echoed unnervingly off the canyon walls. He backed the truck out of the narrow slit, emerging cautiously back into the vast, open expanse of the desert. The world felt raw and exposed in the morning light. There was nowhere to hide. They drove on, the old truck climbing steadily into the foothills. The immediate thrill of the chase was gone, replaced by heavy, vigilant determination. They were no longer just running away. They were on a pilgrimage, a desperate journey to the one place in the world that might offer a real sanctuary. And with every mile that passed, Jack felt the unseen eyes of the hunter on his back.
The character of the journey changed as they ascended. The flat, open desert gave way to a winding, treacherous mountain path that clawed its way up the side of the range. The road was a scar of gravel and rock, with a sheer, dizzying drop on one side and a wall of crumbling stone on the other. Jack's world shrank to the width of the trail. Every ounce of his concentration was focused on the groaning protests of the old truck and the placement of its tires. As they climbed higher into the thin, clean air, something strange began to happen to Jack's perception. It started subtly. He felt a deep, slow awareness of the ancient, gnarled bristlecone pines they passed, sensing their centuries of patient life. He could almost feel the flow of water deep within the rock beneath them. He realized with a jolt that he was passively experiencing Nomad's senses. His friend didn't just see the world, he felt its life force, its deep geological pulse. It was a beautiful and profoundly disorienting sensation. Hours into the climb, the temperature gauge on the truck's dashboard crept into the red. The engine, pushed to its absolute limit, was overheating. Jack found a small, level patch of ground on a high ridge, a natural balcony overlooking the world, and pulled over. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was immense, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the thin, high whisper of the wind. He went to check on his passenger. Nomad was sitting up in his nest of blankets, but he seemed diminished. The faint luminescence from his healing wound had faded, and the silver light in his large eyes was dull. A wave of deep, profound weariness washed over Jack's mind, followed by a feeling of urgency that was aimed like an arrow at the jagged line of peaks ahead of them. The destination wasn't just a place to send a signal, it was a place of restoration. Nomad was running out of time. They waited as the engine cooled and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the endless layers of ridges below them in shades of deep orange, violet, and indigo. The beauty was vast and overwhelming. In the quiet of the coming twilight, Nomad gave Jack a gift. He didn't project an image, he invited Jack to share a memory. For a timeless moment, Jack was no longer a mechanic on a cold mountain. He was a disembodied consciousness floating in the perfect, silent vacuum of deep space. Before him, a stellar nursery bloomed, a cosmic cloud of impossible color. He watched over an eon that passed in a second as gravity drew the dust and gas into a swirling, incandescent ball. He felt the crushing pressure, the rising heat, and then a silent, magnificent ignition, the birth of a star, flooding the void with pure, clean light. He felt a sense of peace so absolute it bordered on ecstasy. The vision receded, leaving Jack breathless on the mountainside, the smell of pine and dust returning to his senses. He looked at the frail being beside him with a new, humbling reverence. He wasn't just saving a life, he was witness to a mind that held the memory of creation itself. The engine was cool. It was time to go. From their high vantage point, they could now clearly see the peak they were aiming for. It was a dark, sharp tooth of rock against the glowing tapestry of the sunset, still miles away. Looking at its stark, distant silhouette and feeling the fading energy of their friend, Jack was gripped by a new kind of fear. It was no longer the fear of being caught by the men in black SUVs. It was the fear of failing the universe. With grim determination, he started the engine and continued their slow, careful climb into the approaching night. The final hours of the climb were a brutal, grinding battle against the mountain. The track dissolved into a treacherous field of boulders and loose scree, forcing Jack to navigate by moonlight and the faint, flickering guidance that Nomad projected into his mind. The truck groaned and scraped, its tires spinning for purchase, until at last, on a small, windswept plateau just below the final peak, it could go no further. The engine sputtered and died with a final weary sigh. They were out of road. Jack gently helped Nomad from the truck. The being was frighteningly frail, his movements slow and weak. The thin mountain air seemed to offer him no sustenance, and he leaned on Jack with almost his full weight. The last 500 feet to the summit had to be made on foot. That climb was the hardest thing Jack had ever done. He half-dragged, half-carried his friend up the steep, rocky incline. The air was thin and bit at his lungs with an icy fire. Every step was a struggle, his muscles screaming in protest and the loose rock shifting precariously under his boots. Nomad was a silent, uncomplaining weight on the back of Jack's mind. He was no longer driven by fear or adrenaline, but by a simple, profound promise he had made in a silent garage worlds away. Finally, gasping for breath, they crested the final ridge and stumbled onto the summit. It was unlike any mountain peak Jack had ever seen. It was a perfectly flat, circular platform about 100 feet across, paved with a strange, dark, glassy stone that seemed to drink the moonlight. The wind howled around them, cold and fierce, but the sky above was a breathtaking dome of brilliant, crystal-clear stars. With the last of his strength, Jack helped Nomad to the precise center of the platform. Nomad sank to his knees, his breath coming in shallow rasps. He looked up at Jack, his dark eyes filled with a final, trusting plea. Then, he placed one of his long, slender hands flat against the glassy surface of the peak. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a low, resonant hum began, not in the air, but vibrating up through the soles of Jack's boots. Faint lines of soft blue light appeared in the stone, spreading out from Nomad's hand like a crackle of lightning in slow motion. They formed an impossibly complex network of geometric patterns, a vast and beautiful circuit board that covered the entire summit. Then, with a silent, breathtaking rush, a pillar of pure blue-white light erupted from the platform. It made no sound, it gave off no heat. It was simply a column of serene, powerful energy, a silent announcement to the stars. Nomad was enveloped within the beam. His frail body seemed to become translucent, the faint light within him brightening, stabilizing, drinking in the energy. He was no longer dying, he was recharging. Jack stumbled backwards, shielding his eyes, a gasp of pure awe escaping his lips. He had done it. He had brought the messenger to the beacon. A wave of profound relief washed over him, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. He stood alone on the roof of the world, watching the silent, beautiful signal pierce the night. He had kept his promise. But as he looked at the brilliant, unmistakable column of light, a new, cold thought entered his mind. A signal this bright and clear wouldn't just be seen by friends from across the stars. It would also be seen by the hunters in the valley below.
For a long time, Jack could only stand and watch, a lone human figure bathed in the ethereal blue glow of the cosmic lighthouse he had helped to build. The wind whipped at his clothes, but he didn't feel the cold. He felt only a profound sense of peace and finality. The humming energy of the beacon vibrated in his very bones, a song from a distant star. The peace was shattered by a familiar, menacing sound, the rhythmic whoomp-whoomp-whoomp of a helicopter ascending fast from the valley below. A moment later, a sleek, black, unmarked gunship crested the ridge. It was the hunters. It hovered 50 yards away, its searchlight pinning Jack to the rock like an insect. Through the cockpit glass, he could see the dark shapes of men in tactical gear, their mission about to reach its violent conclusion. There was nowhere to run. But they were not the only ones to have seen the signal. Just as the helicopter's side door began to slide open, the stars directly above the peak blinked out. Not one by one, but all at once, as if a perfect circle had been cut from the fabric of the night. From this void of absolute blackness, an object descended. It wasn't a ship in any conventional sense. It was a silent, massive three-dimensional shadow, a craft forged from a material that consumed the light and reflected nothing. It made no sound. It simply appeared, dwarfing the helicopter, making the machine of war look like a child's toy. The searchlight on the helicopter flickered and died. The figures inside were frozen, their aggression instantly extinguished by an awe so profound it bordered on terror. They were no longer hunters, they were spectators to something far beyond their comprehension.
On the summit, the pillar of light gracefully receded, pouring back into Nomad so he alone was the source of its soft, internal glow. He stood up, no longer frail or weak, but radiating a quiet, confident power. He turned to Jack, and his final message filled Jack's mind, a voice clearer than any he had ever heard. "My family has come. Thank you, my friend, for everything." There was a pause, and then a genuine offer, an image of star-filled vistas and crystalline cities. "There is a place for you with us, Jack, if you choose." Jack looked from the silent, impossible ship in the sky to the vast, familiar desert stretching out below, now painted in the first soft grays of dawn. He thought of the smell of rain on hot asphalt, the satisfaction of a perfectly tuned engine, the simple, solid feeling of the earth beneath his feet. His journey had been extraordinary, but it had also shown him where he belonged. "My journey is here," Jack thought, projecting the feeling with all the gratitude he could muster. "Yours is out there. Be safe, Nomad." Nomad stepped forward and gently placed his 3 long fingers on Jack's temple. A wave of warmth and clarity washed through Jack's entire being. The chaotic noise of the world resolved into a beautiful, intricate harmony. He could feel the patterns in everything, the crystalline structure of the rock beneath him, the complex mechanics of the distant helicopter, the life cycle of the stars above. The gift was not power, but understanding. A final message settled into his mind. "They will not trouble you now. You are a friend to the travelers." A beam of soft white light descended from the silent ship, enveloping Nomad. He gave Jack one last look, a look of eternal friendship, and then he was lifted into the air. He disappeared into the dark craft. The circle of blackness folded in on itself, and with a final imperceptible ripple, was gone. The stars shone as if nothing had happened. After a moment of stunned silence, the helicopter turned and flew away, its mission aborted, its occupants now bearers of a secret they could never tell. The sun began to rise, flooding the peaks with golden light. Jack stood alone on the summit, a mechanic from a small desert town, now the sole keeper of a cosmic memory. His old life was gone, his garage likely compromised forever. He had a long walk ahead of him, into a future he could not predict. But as he looked out at the awakening world, he felt no fear. He felt only a quiet, boundless peace and the steady, humming pattern of the universe in his soul.